Welcome to the Art of Procurement podcast with your host, Philip Eidson. Here, thought leaders share the trends, strategies, and tactics that you can use to elevate the role of procurement and your career.
Hi there, everybody, and welcome to today's Art of Procurement. And a big thank you for joining me on today's show, because today's guest is Jimmy Anklesaria, and Jimmy is the founder of Anklesaria Group. And I was actually referred to Jimmy 3 different times in a very short period of time over the past, I'd say 3 or 4 months, from listeners both in the US and in actually Australia. And thanks to the introduction from a mutual friend, I was really happy that Jimmy agreed to join me for a conversation on the show. And if you don't know Jimmy, then Jimmy is one of the world's most sought after speakers on the topic of cost management. So he's published many articles on the topic. He's a regular keynote speaker, which is, I know, where at least one of the people who referred me to him had heard him speak. And he's also a workshop leader at both conferences, but also for private organizations. He's actually co-authored 2 different books that are considered to be leading works in the cost management space. And he teaches a graduate course in strategic cost management as the adjunct professor at the University of California, San Diego's Rady School of Business. Finally, Jimmy travels the world assisting Fortune 500 companies in their procurement transformation initiatives, and I can definitely attest to that through Jimmy's hectic travel program as we tried to find time to record the interview today. And you'll hear me talk in the conversation. Just before we went live, Jimmy and I decided to record 2 separate discussions, just because of the volume of content that I wanted to cover and the number of questions that I had. And so today is the first part of that, and we focus on the understanding of cost. So Jimmy provides his perspective on how to better understand cost drivers in products. But what I think is really important to mention, we also talk about services. So this isn't just about manufactured products, but consulting services is an example too. So understand the cost drivers of the things that we buy so that we can use this information as a foundation of cost management strategies, with the idea that those strategies help to build win-win supplier relationships. They're not, we need to change the paradigm of thinking about negotiations and costs in the way that we approach suppliers and demanding what I would call power-based cost reduction. So whoever has the balance of power in the relationship is the one that's able to demand or make demands on the other party. So that's what Jimmy really advocates getting away from. So with all that being said, what I will do is I'll just run the tape. I'll go straight into the show. Hi there, and welcome to today's episode of The Art of Procurement. And as you heard in my introduction, I'm very happy to be joined today by Jimmy Anklesaria. Jimmy is, certainly in my mind, the leading authority within the procurement space on the topic of strategic cost management. And I say strategic because Jimmy's work is really focused on understanding of the data that impacts costs rather than trying to use, what we often do in procurement, which is more power dynamics and leverage to try and force suppliers to provide the pricing that we desire. And Jimmy is somebody who has been recommended to me a number of times. Actually, folks in Australia, folks in Europe, folks in the US, so comes very highly recommended. And I was delighted when a mutual friend was able to connect us, and Jimmy said yes without hesitation to being on the show. So, Jimmy, welcome.
Thank you, Phil. A pleasure to be here, and welcome to your audience.
Thanks. And I actually wanted to start with, it's probably a selfish question, and it's certainly non-procurement. But when I was looking at your LinkedIn profile, the first interest that you had on there was cricket. And that stood out to me because there's not many of us in the US that can say that. In fact, I've actually, in my past in the US, taught a course on cricket to basically teach cricket to folks in the US and liken it to baseball as much as I can. How were you able to keep the interest alive in cricket once you moved to the States?
Oh, well, that's certainly not a strategic question,
No.
But no, I grew up in India, Phil, and played competitive cricket. And more important than playing the game, I happened to be the youngest ever to broadcast cricket at the age of 19 years and 3 months when I did my first class match. So I've had a passion for cricket, as most people in India did. And when I came over to the United States 33 years ago, it was 10 years without cricket, and finally found the Southern California League, and I've played in that league for quite a while. So yeah, it's great to be able to connect, and good luck trying to convince Americans that cricket is an alternative to baseball.
Yeah, maybe, and I keep saying that without cricket there would be no baseball, and then I get, evil eyes shot back at me.
I wouldn't go there.
No.
It's like telling suppliers that without cost data, we're not going to have a good negotiation. So stay away from there.
And the fact that you said you're a broadcaster, I think that puts me under more pressure today. So you're actually a pro on the other side of the mic.
Well, we'll see about that.
I know when we talked before we hit the record button, you told me that procurement certainly wasn't in your initial career plan, when you were back home in India. So how did you become passionate about it? How did you end up being in procurement and specifically focusing on cost management?
Well, I guess for that, it's a question of your belief in fate, belief in karma. I would never in my wildest dreams have thought that, if I were to look back 30-some years ago, that I would be sitting on the other side of a microphone talking about procurement. I grew up in India. My background was more in the field of accounting as a chartered accountant, which many in America would recognize as a CPA. The British would say it's CPA++. And having a law degree and working in a family business, a very large, consortium. But what really turned made a life-changing event in my life was when I came to the United States at the University of San Diego, met a gentleman, Dr. David Burt. He was a marketing professor, but you could see that he was teaching marketing, but really had his passion on the other side of the mirror, which is procurement.
Right.
And he kept talking to me about this thing called procurement. And being a person who had served on many boards, being in the C-level and things like that at a very young age, I had been exposed to numerous corporations. And I had to actually correct him and say, I'm sorry, Dr. Burt, I know you seem to have a fondness for this thing called procurement, but let me tell you quite honestly, having, been in senior leadership at so many companies, I hate to tell you that no one really cares a damn about procurement.
Right.
They are table-thumping, loud-mouthed buyers who fight with suppliers, who take in bids and take the lowest bid and run with it. So really, you don't need much in terms of brain power to choose a number that 99 is less than 100. So he really convinced me with the most basic of let's say explanations. He said, Jimmy, come to my office, which I did. I thought I was in for a severe reprimand for interrupting the class. And he said, well, take a pen, go to the whiteboard, and write, since you're an accountant, write down the 5 major elements that make up the revenue of any corporation. So very dutifully, I wrote direct material, direct labor, manufacturing overhead, the sum of which is the cost of goods sold, general selling administrative expenses, and profit. Stood back and said, okay, now what? He said, well, I put the revenue equal to 100%. Take any of the companies that you happen to have been this C-level officer or, director or whatever, and try to break down, to the best of your knowledge and memory, try to break down that $100. Okay, so I kind of looked at one of my companies, and I said, well, let's take, for an average, 60 cents on the dollar is material, 5 cents for labor, 15 cents for manufacturing overhead, which is about a 300% on direct labor markup. And that takes us to about 80. And I said, well, let's put down 15 for, I said, put 15 for GS&A and 5 for profit. So what? What does this mean? And he said, well, take another color pen, and next to this, write down which of these numbers are spent through third parties. So I said, well, that's pretty obvious. Direct material, unless you're totally vertically integrated, it's purchased from the outside, so that's 60 cents on the dollar. Direct labor, obviously, is in-house. Manufacturing overhead, the big ones in a very automated world, is depreciation. And then there's, of course, indirect labor, which is internal. Your people are internal, but then we tend to outsource things like security, cafeteria, and stuff. So I said, okay, take a wild guess. It's probably half of it. So let's go with about 7 or 8. And out of your GS&A Most of that is corporate type overhead. And I said, well, there's, sales, marketing expenses, advertising agencies. And today, more and more companies are outsourcing IT and things like that. So maybe 2%. And I added those up and it came to 17. And by then I kind of saw what was happening. He just sat back in his chair, smug look on his face, and he said, okay, Jimmy, so you're a C-level officer. You count yourself as a finance, accounting type guy. You're willing to put 70 cents of every revenue dollar in the hands of these procurement guys whom you've just described as, pretty much brain dead,
right.
3 bids in a cloud of dust. What kind of reflection is it on you as a leader to put 70 cents on the dollar into the hands of the lowest in terms of skill level, competence, etc.? And boy, did the lights go off in my head. And I said to myself, wow, absolutely great opportunity to take this particular niche and bring it to the strategic level that it richly deserves. Mm-hmm. And so I became his disciple. I was honored to be a co-author of a book called Zero-Based Pricing, and then went around the world spreading this knowledge of, building cost models, understanding market data, building MBA programs to take people through a rigorous supply chain management program so that the future procurement people, and this was 1986,
right.
Future procurement professionals would be brilliant, would be engineers with MBAs, for example. And here we are, 30-some years later, and I can see it's not perfect, but it's certainly come a long, long, long way.
What kind of reception did you get when you started going on the road and, once the light bulb had gone off in your mind and trying to convince others of the same thing?
Oh, it was brilliant. I couldn't have asked for anything better, because I'd do a 1-hour speech and ask people. I mean, I would ask some very, very basic questions. For example, I would look in an audience, a few hundred people, and I'd say, by show of hands, how many of you are under any pressure to reduce cost? And of course, everyone in the audience hand would go up.
Right.
The next question I'd say, I want you to look deep inside and be honest and truthful. How many of you can honestly say that you understand the cost of the goods, services, or equipment that you're buying? And you'd probably say about 5%.
Right.
So my third question, which was rhetorical, would be, well, then help me. How are we supposed to do something which is so important to 95% of us, and yet only 5% can say they truly understand? How do you manage cost when most people don't understand cost? What's the first step? Let's understand cost. And how do you understand cost? By having a methodology. Zero-based pricing was one of them.
So it was a relatively easy sell once you managed to get people in the room.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And once they saw the power of cost modeling, the respect, the credibility that it brought, it made people realize, wow, I mean, I can really be a major player. Mm-hmm. And also a very clear understanding that just knowing the cost is a good thing, but not enough. That's just the foundation
right.
for a cost management strategy. You can't just say, oh, well, I know the cost. Well, so what?
Right. Yeah. What
can you do about it?
Right.
What are you going to do with that? That took me to my second book called Supply Chain Cost Management, the Aim and Drive Process for Achieving Extraordinary Results. And in that book, we go beyond the cost breakdown, where we get into cost drivers, strategic options, mm-hmm. risk analysis, implementation, validation, et cetera, et cetera. So I think at the end of the day now, let's say people around the world, whether they're procurement people, engineering, or any other group, even marketing, have used this methodology. First thing is understand cost before you manage it, but we've got to give you a process to understand cost called zero-based pricing.
Right.
And once you do that, we give you a process called Aim and Drive to manage cost and write a cost management strategy.
And so actually that's a really good kind of overview of where I think we want to go with the conversation. And actually, some inside baseball, in advance of each interview, I will prepare an overview, and it kind of helps bring some structure to a conversation, just to make sure we cover as much as we can in the time we have available. And Jim and I walked through this before we got on the call, and there's so much that we didn't think it would do it justice to try and cram everything into a single episode. So we're actually going to split this up into two different parts. And today we're going to touch on the understanding of the cost, cost structures and the drivers that impact the products and services that we buy, so that we can then level the playing field, with the supply base through that initial sourcing and negotiating process. And then in part two, and that's going to be, we'll publish that in a couple of weeks' time, we'll go one step further and then look about partnering with your suppliers to strategically manage the cost through things like continuous improvement once the contract is signed. So as opposed to trying to fit it all in today, let's focus on the understanding of the cost today. And that leads me to the first question that I had, and that's, what do you wish that we as procurement professionals would actually do differently when it comes to, understanding costs and ultimately negotiating pricing?
Well, I guess, Phil, anyone who's taken Negotiation 101 would have learned that the most important part of the negotiation process is preparation. Mm-hmm. And yet, when I look around and ask people, well, how did you prepare for the negotiation? I hear people saying, well, I went to this negotiation class and they told me that preparation would be to overwhelm your supplier. If they've got 3 people, make sure we've got 8. Make them sit on lower stools. Put the air conditioning on them. And I look at these people and I say, you're not serious, are you? You really think that if you made me sit on a lower stool than you, or a lower chair, if you put me in front, if I'm the CEO and you put me in front of your buyer while your CFO is sitting on the other side of the table, you really think that that's going to make a difference in the way I'm going to negotiate, and I'm going to just give you everything because I'm at a lower level? And I think to myself, how can people possibly go out there, pay good money, take a course that tells them, sit at a higher level than your supplier? I believe that, and I hope people will agree with me, that the only power in negotiation is the power of knowledge. Mm-hmm. And the only way, if at all, you want to show some negotiation advantage over your so-called opponent — I don't believe in their opponents. I think we're sitting across the table with common good, but that's different. I think the only way you can I'm not even trying to get an upper hand on my supplier. All I'm trying to do is to be looking eyeball to eyeball, fact to fact, and that comes from knowledge. So to me, preparation is more about knowledge, doing excellent amount of market research to find out what is the competitive nature of the market, what are the supplier's strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, who are the alternatives, what's the aggregate market, how is it growing, etc. Good understanding of the technology, because many times suppliers come in with technical knowledge, buyers typically have commercial knowledge, and they get overwhelmed with the technology. So either I need, as a good buyer, to have a technological advantage or at least knowledge, and if not, bring someone on my team who has that level of technology. And then we get into cost knowledge. And I'll tell you quite honestly, Phil, and all the listeners out there, cost knowledge is something that most suppliers do not have. Right. You would be amazed that most suppliers do not know their own costs. And so when you, as a buyer, show a good, rational, logical, fact-based cost model, most suppliers are like, wow, we didn't know that. Right. And so I think that's what tilts the negotiation balance more in favor of a buyer being well prepared. And so I think, quite honestly, preparation needs to be looked at a little differently than where you force the air conditioner and where you put your seats.
And there's an interesting point you made as well that I wanted to pull out, and that's that you're not doing this to try and get an upper hand necessarily, but you want to have all the data available so you're making the right decision on price, but also on a lot of other factors regarding your relationship with the supplier, because ultimately you want to be engaging with suppliers, and this is maybe more so for those products and services that are more material than some of the commodities, but still you want a long-term sustainable relationship with your suppliers. You don't necessarily want something that you come out way ahead and your supplier suffers, because ultimately you're going to feel the pain in some way, shape or form, either through cost increases, through bankruptcies, through poor quality, through them not investing in your account. So it's more down to having the facts on the table so it's a win-win, rather than one person benefiting at the cost of the other person.
Absolutely. This is a professional relationship. This is a business deal. This is not like a a wrestling match out there, So I fully agree with you.
So what can a procurement professional do then to start to better understand the cost of a product or service before they negotiate?
Well, I mean, sometimes it's as basic as building and what we call an industry cost profile. People want to go out there and build the most fancy spreadsheet, which is so complex that the person who built it, typically a consultant, is the only one who understands it. Mm-hmm. So I'm a strong believer in inherent capability. Don't go outside to pay big consultants. I'm not saying they can't build a model. They'll build a phenomenal model, but only they can understand it. And unless they're doing the negotiation, someone who buys a cost model from a consultant with, 1,000 lines of, spreadsheets and macros and stuff like that, the supplier just has to invalidate one assumption, and the buyer is scratching his or her head because now what do you do? Because unless the consultant's going to be at that table to go back and tell you how you got this data, where you got this data, how you made this assumption, you're going to look pretty sheepish. So what I suggest is start with one little step. If you could visualize a circle, that's the cost knowledge. You start with a big zero, a big zero. You do not know in that zero how much is material, labor, overhead, GSA, profit. So the first step in my modeling is understand what we call an industry cost profile. An industry cost profile is simply looking at the aggregate in a specific industry, looking at the NAIS codes or whatever industry classification, using publicly available statistical data to break down an industry's revenue into these various pieces. You use a combination of manufacturing data and financial data. In some cases, we may narrow it down instead of being as wide as the entire industry. When there are 4 or 5 key players in the industry, we may ignore the hundreds of others and take the income statements, if they are publicly held, of those 3, 4, or 5 and create a narrower, what we call a peer average versus a whole industry average. But the objective is still the same. Try to go inside that zero and on a very macro level try to figure out, like I said in my example with Dr. Burt, 60% is material and 5% is labor and so on. The next step would be, okay, if 60% is labor, let's not try to get, 60% is material, let's not try to get and nitpick the labor and, how many people and how many steps in the process and how many seconds and cycle time and stuff. That can come later. Let's just try to break down the bill of materials. Let's try either using publicly held, publicly available, using a U.S. Census information, material by kind, break down the material into, for example, if you were building something that was, let's say, a pump or something like that. Well, first of all, how much is the pump material over the total? Well, if you did look at the U.S. Census, you'd find that in the manufacturing of a basic pump, which I think is a pretty standard mechanical object, it's 52.9%. Well, that's a lot more than I thought 10 minutes ago, because 10 minutes ago I had absolutely no idea. Okay, so 52.9%. Then by going into the next step, which is, okay, in the same U.S. Census, going down a little further, I look at materials by kind. I find the 3 most common raw materials used in manufacturing a pump are steel, metal fasteners, and aluminum castings. And according to the statistics, 86% is steel, 5.6% is metal fasteners, 8.4% is aluminum castings. So now I say, okay, if steel represents 86% of 52.9%, well, steel represents about 45.5% of the whole.
Yeah.
And so on and so forth. So now I've got 52.9% broken down in these 3 cost elements, or 3 sub-elements, because it's all under direct material. Now I've got to go and look at some market data. Okay, what's the price of steel? What type of steel is it? How much steel is being used in this particular? So you need a little bit more insight into the bill of materials. But the point I'm trying to make is, what if I'm able to say that on an average, say 52 or 53% of the product is made out of steel, aluminum, and metal plasters. And let's, for the sake of simplicity, let's just say that the total of that coincidentally happens to be $52.90, just for the heck of it. Well, if $52.90 is your raw material, and on an average, 52.9% happens to be the percentage, well, you're looking at approximately, plus or minus a little, you're looking at approximately $100 part. Now, of course, I could have changed the numbers and have to scratch my head and do the math. But I hope your listeners get the drift that if I can monetize one of the major cost elements, in this case, it's a material-driven item, well, you take and try to monetize the material and then divide that number by the percentage that material reflects on the total, as from the industry statistics, and voila, you've at least got a starting point.
It's a guide, at
now,
least.
Yeah, a lot of people feel, well, this is great in materials, but what about the labor world? What about a service world?
Yeah.
Exactly the same. Exactly the same. The only difference is we may not have material in an IT consulting contract, for example. You may just say, well, we're being billed $2,500 a day for a software engineer. I have no idea whether that's good or bad or whatever. I just try and say, well, how about if I get 10% lower than that? And you're very comfortable with the 2,250 or something, and you feel very pleased with yourself. Versus, if I did the exact same thing, looked at the industry statistics and found that on an average, approximately 30% of every revenue dollar in the IT consulting world, on an average, 30 cents on the dollar is paid as wages and bonus, not benefits, not taxes, not computing, software, etc. Just the pure W-2, as we call it in the United States. If that number is 30 cents or 30%, now what I do is I would monetize it by looking at the breakdown of the team. And for each person, I would say, well, if it's a software programmer, mid-level, high-level, junior, I can look at numerous industry sources like salary.com, salaryexpert.com, salaryreview.com, wageweb.com, careerjournal.com. You get the idea. If I can look at that and say, okay, software engineer in Bangalore, India, or in New York, or in Houston, Texas, it's absolutely irrelevant where it is. I can get that data. So let's take a very simple and hypothetical example. What if I saw that this individual, whoever he or she may be, in this part of the world, on the higher side, because I don't want the worst software guys, I want good software engineers, I'm willing to pay 75th percentile, that's in the upper limit. And let's just, for the sake of an argument, say that this is about $100,000, just for an argument and keeping it very simplistic. Well, that equates to approximately $50 an hour, approximately. It's probably less. But if it's $50 an hour, and $50 is the equivalent of monetizing steel, it's now monetized people, if the average of that group is $50 an hour, and 50 represents 30%, or 33% to keep it simple, you're looking at an hourly rate of approximately 150 or a daily rate of 1,200, 1,300 maybe.
Yeah.
So where did 2,500 come from? Now, I'm not saying that we will pay 1,200, nothing more, nothing less. But what I believe is it gives you the opportunity to walk your supplier step by step. This is the person. This is the 75th percentile. This is the location. This is the salary without anything else. In a typical situation, 30, 32%, 33% is labor. So if labor is 150 or 1,200 a day, just help me understand. Here's a pen. Tell me where I went wrong. Did I make a wrong assumption? Did this person really earn $200,000?
Right.
If you're paying your people $200,000, how come the industry is at $100,000? Are you overpaying? And if you're overpaying, should they be doing it in half the time with less mistakes? So let me understand. And I'll tell you, take a humble approach versus saying, son of a gun, you've been taking me to the cleaners.
Yeah.
Take it all. I always say, keep a pen in your pocket, give them the pen, tell me where did I go wrong. And that type of way brings us a much better, let's say, position in both product and services. So you get more respect, you get credibility, and the next time, you better believe it, they will never try to do something like this because they know when you deal with company X, you're going to see some very intelligent buyers. And that's all we're looking for.
Yeah, and you can take that to the next level once you start breaking it down. And I was interested about you talking about services because, when I think of cost modeling, often you kind of understand how that can apply in the manufacturing space. And then it gets a little bit more, not necessarily difficult, but it's just not as clear in the services space. But you can then start, if you're understanding exactly what each one of those individuals is doing and what each one of those individuals is getting paid or have a good idea of it, you could actually start to even change the pricing model from, well, we're going to spend this much because we're getting access to these people to, well, if it costs us X to get Y outcome, why don't we start pricing and buying on outcomes rather than on people?
Yeah, and more companies are doing that, Phil. It's clear, but there's one little issue that needs to be understood as well. Pricing, believe me, pricing is pretty easy. There's enough data out there that you can do this for product or service, and I haven't even gone into the more detailed type of cost models. But there's another part of it, and that's demand, usage. So I can say, okay, it's not $2,500 an hour, it's $1,400 an hour. A day, I'm sorry. But the question is, how many days? How many hours? And so for that, you need to get a little bit deeper into what we call cost drivers to be able to assess what is the total cost of that contract, not what's the hourly rate or the daily rate. Because many times, let's think about it. If someone were to really squeeze me as a professional and tell me, well, you're not worth $2,500 a day, you're worth $1,500 a day. Now, I've got a certain target that I want to get out of my people. So what do? I just find an excuse and add to the scope of work and just put them on the ground for so many more days. So it's very important if you are really looking at total cost. Once you finish negotiating the rates, I believe, quite honestly, that there are greater potential in savings when you look at time.
Right.
Finding ways in which, for example, you could have big consultants put a bevy of these little MBA kids running around, where 2 of them are really doing the work and 6 of them are shadowing and learning.
Yeah.
You're paying for 8 people and things like that. So, and then doing things like basic surveys. I remember one of my clients was being charged by a very large consulting company at the rate of $4,000 a day to survey about 1,100 employees. And this was a part of an assessment. And I said, my good gosh, if you looked at how much you paid to do that survey, couldn't it have been a survey, electronic survey, get your people to fill it in, and then call the consultants in to sort of clarify a point here or a point there, and you could have reduced this cost of this survey by 90%, 95%.
Or just do a representative sample or something. Yeah.
We've got to find better ways of managing both rate and time.
And the time also talks to efficiency, doesn't it? So you may have somebody who is being paid on, let's just say they're getting $2,000 a day, but their efficiency is 80 or 90%. Versus somebody who's getting paid $1,500 a day and their efficiency is 50%. Well, you're actually getting more for your money by paying more because you actually need them for less period of time.
Absolutely. That's what we typically mean by the total cost of ownership, the total cost, because it's much easier to say, well, I negotiated a great deal and now they give you their C-level people versus the A-level people, And these people are going to make mistakes. They are more inexperienced. And then you're going to have to redo stuff, or the outcome is not as great as it could have been. What's the value of that? So I think that takes us beyond price.
Right. One of the keys is the data inputs. And you talked about finding information in census or finding information online, various different websites. How do you figure out what the sources of information are that you can go and lever? And are they typically free and available, or do you find that you have to buy data to be able to input into these models?
Both. I think, to begin with, quite honestly, maybe that's being in the procurement world for too long. I always look for free data.
Right.
And believe me, it is important to first understand whether don't start getting into the free versus paid. First, understand what your requirements are, what your needs are.
Yeah.
I always tell people, it is better to be approximately correct than to be exactly wrong. Mm-hmm. And some analysts, I think it's more a defense of their own position. Either they're analysts and they want to show their bosses that they're so indispensable, or they're consultants and they want to show the value of their time. And they try to make the model so complex that requires such deep insight into mining data from the bottom of the earth that the incremental information you got by getting that absolute so-called precise information would have cost you so much, just not worth it.
Right.
You could have achieved your goal. Your goal is to show your supplier that you have a good understanding of cost. Your goal is not to show that you are precisely correct, because if anyone told me that, I will show you mathematically through equations, it is mathematically impossible to predict the exact cost of anything unless every single variable is a constant, which means it's not a variable.
Yeah.
And that's impossible. So, I'm a strong believer that, use publicly available data, use your RFI. There is a very important tool in your armory, and that's an RFI. Ask the right questions, and you wouldn't have to go out and search for the data. But yes, I will agree, sometimes you do need to pay a little bit of money, and I strongly advise companies, invest a little bit, a few thousands of dollars, and get some of that data which you couldn't access through publicly available sources. And one last thing I'd like to tell your listeners, Phil, there was a client of ours that paid a very, very, let's say, well-known research company. If I remember correctly, it was $186,000 for a certain, amount, certain information, certain data. $186,000. My guys were working on a cost model, kind of similar work, and there was a big, scream from one of the people in the office, and we all gathered around his desk, and he showed us through a certain university. Looking at the university's library, he accessed data which I would say was about 90% similar. Clearly, this research company had used that data and added a little bit of their own quote-unquote opinion to produce some additional information, and for which the client was paying $186,000. Of course, when I showed it to the client and I said, well, would you like to pay $186 for this, or would you like to do this other one for free? You can imagine what they did.
Right.
So my point is, the reason why we pay for data is many times because we're lazy and we don't want to go out and find it ourselves.
Yeah. So I just had one last question, and that was, you talked a lot about, researching information, finding information, and you kind of digging for a lot of it. Does it make sense, and I think maybe this is a question for larger organizations and smaller organizations, does it make sense for us to have the buyers trying to do that themselves, or to actually hire somebody who is a specialist in research, in market research, and that can turn this data around a lot quicker and actually know where to look for it?
That's a good question, Phil, and I think that's a question a lot of companies have wrestled with. I'll tell you what the really good ones have done. The good ones have provided their buyers and category managers with research assistants, or you can call them basically analysts.
Yeah.
So they've created a market intelligence cell within the company. So absolutely agree with you. You can't have the typical buyer, category manager, spending a lot of time doing all the research, et cetera, because they've got to run the business itself. So we do have these. You can either have an intelligence cell within the company, or you can outsource and say, well, I'd like someone to support my category managers, my buyers.
Yeah.
But I want to make this very, very clear. You cannot abdicate responsibility as a buyer or as a category manager by saying, well, I don't need to know any of this stuff. Someone else is going to do the work. Because otherwise, you're going to go back to what I said earlier in the podcast, which is you hire a consultant, they do all the work, and then you go in front of the supplier with this so-called, weapon, and then you pull the trigger, nothing happens. Because the supplier nails you on one little assumption, and you have absolutely no idea. So what the really good companies do is they train their buyers, their engineers, their category managers and others. They train them in this process. They train them, they go through the class, they go through where information is located, etc., etc., etc. So the point is they know how to drive the car if the driver gets shot.
Right.
You don't want the car going out of control.
No.
So the point I'm making is understand it yourself unless your business analyst is going to be at every single negotiation session, and that's a physical impossibility.
Yeah.
A typical business analyst is supporting 4 or 5 or 6 teams, and he or she can't be at every one of those meetings. So again, I look at some people, and these don't even have to be category managers. These could be people as high as the CPO. One of my, the CPOs that I really admire is Tom Linton. Tom happens to be at present the Chief Supply Officer, Senior Vice President at Flex, Flextronics in the old days. And he used to be at LG before that, at IBM and stuff like that. What I admired about people like Tom, and there are many, many others, I'm just using Tom as an example. Way back in 1995, he took my class, he understood this, he knew how to do it himself. Now he's a CPO, he challenges his team to do this type of information. When his people come up to him and say, well, this is not available and that's not available, Tom swivels around, gets onto his computer, shows it to them and says, well, here's what I found, how's it you guys couldn't find it?
Right.
So my point being, remember back to the knowledge is power. Weapons are not power.
Mm-hmm.
So if your cost model is treated like a weapon, I'm sorry, you're going to fail. But if you know the methodology and you just outsource the physical construction of the model, but you know how to do it if you were given the time, then I'd say you're on the right track.
Right.
So I hope that message is loud and clear. You do need to have a few specialists whose job is to go out there and find the data, but everyone using the data must have had reasonable knowledge on how that data was constructed.
So, it seems from the outside to be a relatively labor-intensive process. So do you recommend, really understanding the cost drivers, understanding the cost elements, building the cost models only for certain categories or categories that have certain characteristics, or is it really not that labor-intensive at all once you have it set up?
I believe once you have it set up, it's not that labor-intensive at all. And even if you make a few strides, you're still better off than simply walking in and say, give me a 10% discount.
Right.
Remember, a percentage of a wrong number is a wrong number. So I always believe start from zero, build it up. You may not be perfect. It's like a jigsaw puzzle, Phil. You first put in the corners, the edges, the colors, and over time, it becomes a beautiful, clear picture.
Yeah.
But if you're not willing to put in the effort, then it's so much easier. And let me make sure that people understand it is so much easier to ask for a 10% discount. It takes 10 seconds to do that.
Mm-hmm.
But in the long run, the one who invests the time, builds an intelligence base, understands the market sources of information, and uses it effectively with that knowledge, gains the power, gains the respect, and makes a major, major change in the cost structure and not these 5 and 10% changes.
So that brings me to really my final question, I think, as we wrap up the first part of our 2-part series here on cost management, and that's the impact of culture. So when I think back to my past experiences, you often see, kind of goes in a cycle. So you have a CPO or a leader who comes in, it's all about cost, but it's all about, for the want of a better word, beating up your suppliers, getting that cost reductions as quickly as possible. And you do that for a year or two, and then it's not sustainable. and the CPO loses their job, and then somebody else comes in and they're starting to think more strategically, and the cost savings don't come fast enough, and a couple of years later they lose their job, and the cycle repeats itself. So I guess a couple of things. One is how important is building the culture so that you're not just going to go and beat up your suppliers, you're going to think more strategically, but also how do you balance the need for short-term wins, if you will, versus the fact that using some of these strategies may have longer-term benefits, but it may not be a short-term win.
Phil, like anyone else, it's all about results.
Mm-hmm.
So it's what gets us the best results. I believe it's not just the CPO; it's more the CEO, CFO level.
Right.
That's where the direction comes from a company where culture is concerned. And let's be grown up. People change.
Yeah.
People move on. Whether they're laid off or fired or move on to better things. So we have to understand that it will be a change in culture. The question is the process robust enough that it can withstand these changes? I've seen situations where companies have been benchmarked in terms of a culture of collaboration, cost modeling, working collaboratively with suppliers across cross-functional teams to take cost out, to improve quality, technology, etc. A new management team comes in, new brooms must sweep, so they sweep aside all this and they move to e-auctions, confrontation versus collaboration, and they see some, what I call fear-based cost reduction, where suppliers who are so desperate will give you 20%, 30% because they don't want to lose you as a customer. That's not sustainable. And so you rightly point out, a new change comes along and we're back to collaboration. We go on an apology tour and apologize to all those suppliers and beg them to work with us. So my point is there a solution? Perhaps. The solution is when you are consistent, when you are extremely tough, wonderfully fair. If you can achieve those 4 words, extremely tough, data-based, fact-based, knowledge-based discussion, regardless of who's on the top. And the second part is wonderfully fair, where you look at it, no quarter given, none asked. I'm not here for charity, but I'm not here to take you out of business. Right. If you can keep those 4 words in your mind, practice it, embed processes. And to me, that is far more important than people. If you embed processes, people tend to use those processes and they're not, let's say, so influenced by people at the top. So, again, a strong believer in process and empowering people. And again, if I could repeat it for the sake of driving home this point, build inherent capability. If you build inherent capability, you are not dependent on consultants, because let's put it where it's supposed to be put, in its right place. Consultants are typically, and I'm not saying all, typically a reflection of the leadership. Leader A comes in, he or she has their favorite consulting company who has their favorite, let's say, e-auction program, and here we go. Another leader comes in, he or she has a consultant who believes in collaboration, etc. Here we go. So my point is, nothing against the consultant, but you cannot be a great company when you do not have inherent capability. And that's my most important point to your listeners.
Well, with that, Jimmy, I just want to thank you for your time today in taking us through, some thoughts about how we can better understand costs as we go into negotiations, but also to use that not necessarily to beat up our suppliers, but to have more intelligent conversations. And I think that's one of the key things to bring from it is to change that paradigm of it being a win and lose versus, well, how can we use this information so that we have a situation where we both profit, which is ultimately what a long-term sustainable relationship looks like. Very last question. This is an easy one. If listeners would like to understand a little bit more or find out a little bit more about Anklesaria Group, where would you point them?
Well, of course, they could visit the website, www.anklesaria.com, or just shoot us an email, info@anklesaria.com, and someone will get back to you. it's been my pleasure to do this podcast interview with you, Phil, and if there's anything else that I can do, just let me know.
Great. Well, I look forward to part 2. I think we have it slated for a couple of weeks to do a bit more of a deep dive on what you can do once the sourcing decision's been made. But what I will do in terms of contact details is I'm going to link those up on the show notes for today's episode. Those are going to be at artofprocurement.com/understandingcost. That's artofprocurement.com/understandingcost. So, Jimmy, just one last time, thank you very much.
Thank you, and have a good one.
Thank you for listening to another episode of The Art of Procurement. To find an archive of all past episodes, you can go to artofprocurement.com/episodes. And to ensure you never miss another show, go to artofprocurement.com/subscribe.